The birthday cake looked perfect. Blue and green frosting swirled across its surface like ocean waves, plastic dinosaurs frozen mid-roar along the edges, candles waiting to be lit in Mrs. Kelly's third-grade classroom. 23 eight-year-olds sat cross-legged on the rainbow carpet, their eyes bright with anticipation as streamers fluttered from the ceiling fans above. It was supposed to be Aiden Carter's first birthday celebration at his new school in upstate New York, a chance for the quiet boy with the nervous smile to finally feel like he belonged somewhere. The cake had arrived at exactly 10 o'clock that morning, hand-delivered by a man in a sun-faded Yankees cap who called himself Uncle Tony, though his sunglasses never came off indoors, and his smile stretched just a little too wide across his weathered face. Mrs. Kelly had been teaching for 15 years, long enough to make every birthday special, long enough to trust that a cake was just a cake. But across the room, something ancient and primal stirred in the chest of Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat rippled with tension as his amber eyes locked onto that innocent-looking dessert. His handler, Officer Lisa Brennan, noticed the change immediately. Ranger's ears snapped forward like radar dishes, his muscular frame going rigid as a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep in his throat. This wasn't curiosity or hunger. This was warning. This was the sound of a predator recognizing danger that human senses couldn't detect. The children's laughter seemed to fade into background static as Ranger's growl grew louder, more insistent, his black lips pulling back to reveal teeth that glinted like ivory daggers in the fluorescent classroom lighting. Mrs. Kelly's cheerful voice faltered mid-sentence as 23 pairs of young eyes turned toward the dog whose instincts had never once been wrong, whose nose could detect threats that lurked beneath layers of frosting and lies, whose very presence in that room was about to mean the difference between celebration and catastrophe. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whisper of Aiden's voice as he stepped back from the table, his small hands trembling like autumn leaves in a storm. "My uncle said not to eat it," the boy murmured, his words carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for someone so young to bear. "He said just pretend it was from him." Those haunting words hung in the air like smoke signals from a burning bridge, and Officer Lisa Brennan felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that what looked like an innocent birthday celebration might actually be the opening act of something far more sinister, something that would test every instinct she and Ranger had developed through years of partnership in the dangerous dance between good and evil that played out daily on the streets of their small town. The bomb squad's portable X-ray scanner hummed like a mechanical heartbeat as it passed over the seemingly innocent birthday cake, its digital display casting an eerie blue glow across the faces of the assembled officers who had evacuated every child from the building except one. Aiden Carter stood frozen beside Officer Lisa Brennan, his 9-year-old frame trembling, not from fear of the uniformed strangers surrounding him, but from the terrible knowledge that had been eating away at his soul for months, like acid through metal. Ranger remained motionless, as a statue carved from obsidian, his intelligent eyes never leaving the cake box that had triggered every alarm bell in his highly trained mind. The scanner's operator, a grizzled veteran named Martinez, whose hands had defused more explosive devices than he cared to count, suddenly went pale as the internal structure of the cake materialized on his screen like a digital autopsy revealing hidden cancer. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the electronic whirring. "There's something metallic in there wrapped in plastic, nestled right in the base layer." Lisa's radio crackled to life as backup units surrounded the school, their red and blue lights painting the autumn afternoon in colors of emergency and dread. But it was Aiden's next words that sent ice water flooding through every vein in her body, words spoken so quietly they might have been mistaken for a prayer, if not for their devastating implications. "He told me if I said anything he'd make my mum disappear again," the boy confessed, his voice breaking like glass against concrete. "Again!" Lisa knelt beside him, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon as the full scope of what they were dealing with began to crystallize in her mind like frost forming on a window in winter. The cake wasn't just a delivery system for whatever deadly surprise lay hidden beneath its cheerful exterior. It was a message, a threat, a chess move in a game where children were pawns and mothers were leverage. And birthday parties became battlegrounds in wars that decent people never knew were being fought in the shadows of their everyday lives. as Martinez carefully lifted the top layer of frosting with surgical precision, revealing the cold steel barrel of a loaded handgun taped inside like a sleeping serpent waiting to strike. Lisa realized that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test everything she believed about justice, protection, and the lengths to which evil would go to. Silence those brave enough to stand against it in the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching us from? In the small town of Millbrook, New York, where autumn leaves painted the streets in shades of amber and crimson, most people believed that evil was something that happened in big cities, in places far removed from their tree-lined neighborhoods and friendly corner stores. They were wrong. Evil had not only found its way to their doorstep, but it had learned to disguise itself behind familiar faces, false smiles, and birthday cakes decorated with plastic dinosaurs. This is the story of Ranger, a German shepherd whose extraordinary instincts would uncover a web of corruption and trafficking that reached from the highest levels of law enforcement to the most vulnerable children in their community. It's a story about Officer Lisa Brennan, whose partnership with Ranger would be tested in ways she never imagined when she first clipped that K9 leash to her belt 5 years earlier. But most importantly, this is the story of children like Aiden Carter and Marley Winters, whose voices had been silenced by adults who saw them not as human beings deserving protection, but as commodities to be traded, threatened, and manipulated in service of greed and power. The events that unfolded over the course of 18 months would shake the foundations of everything the residents of Millbrook thought they knew about safety, trust, and the thin blue line that supposedly protected them from the darkness. It began with a birthday cake and a dog's growl, but it would end with the exposure of a trafficking network that had been operating in plain sight for years, using the very systems designed to protect children as hunting grounds. For predators, Ranger's nose could detect more than narcotics and explosives. He could smell fear, deception, and danger in ways that human technology could never replicate. His partnership with Lisa Brennan wasn't just professional, it was a bond forged through countless hours of training, mutual respect, and an understanding that in their line of work, trust wasn't just important, it was the difference between life and death. As you'll discover in the pages that follow, sometimes the most important voices in a room belong to those who cannot speak at all, and sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs rather than 2. This story will challenge everything you think you know about intuition, about listening to warnings that don't come in words, and about the courage it takes to stand up to evil, even when that evil wears a badge, carries authority, or hides behind the innocent face of someone you trust. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise that Ranger and Lisa would eventually uncover, but the realization that it could have been prevented if more people had been willing to listen to the warnings that were hiding in plain sight. Children who were too afraid to speak, mothers who disappeared without explanation, and a dog whose instincts were so finely tuned that he could detect danger before it fully materialized into action. The trafficking ring that used Millbrook as its base of operations had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through legitimate channels, exploiting bureaucratic blind spots, and counting on the fact that most people would rather believe in coincidences than confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters often look exactly like the people we trust most. Ranger's story is ultimately about the power of paying attention, about trusting instincts even when they don't make logical sense, and about the extraordinary capacity of animals to perceive threats that human beings, with all our sophisticated technology and analytical capabilities, somehow manage to miss. As this investigation unfolds, you'll witness how a single dog's refusal to ignore his instincts would save not just individual lives, but expose a systematic abuse of power that had been destroying families and exploiting children for years. The question that haunts every chapter of this story is simple yet profound. How many other warnings do we ignore every day, and what might the world look like if we learned to listen with the same clarity and certainty as a German shepherd named Ranger, who refused to let evil hide behind the innocent facade of a birthday celebration? The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear in Millbrook, with the kind of golden sunlight that made the maple trees lining Elm Street look like they were on fire. Inside Lincoln Elementary School, Mrs. Kelly's third-grade classroom buzzed with the anticipatory energy that only comes with birthday celebrations and sugar-fueled excitement. She had transformed her learning space into a festival of color, with hand-drawn birthday banners strung between the windows and a special chair decorated with ribbons waiting for Aidan Carter, the quiet new student who had joined their class just 6 weeks earlier. Aidan sat at his desk, small fingers drumming nervously against the wooden surface as he watched his classmates arrange themselves in the traditional birthday circle on the reading carpet. His dark eyes held a wariness that seemed far too mature for a 9-year-old, the kind of careful observation that comes from living in environments where survival depends on reading the moods and intentions of adults who cannot be trusted. Mrs. Kelly had noticed this about Aidan from his first day, how he would freeze when voices were raised, how he always positioned himself near exits, how he never quite relaxed even during story time, when the other children would sprawl comfortably on their bellies, completely absorbed in whatever adventure she was reading aloud. Officer Lisa Brennan and Ranger had arrived at the school for their weekly community visit, a program designed to build positive relationships between law enforcement and young children, while allowing Ranger to maintain his socialization skills in controlled environments. The German Shepherd's presence usually brought joy and excitement to the classroom, with children eagerly raising their hands to share stories about their own pets or ask questions about police work. But today something was different. The moment they entered the classroom, Ranger's demeanor shifted from the relaxed friendliness he typically displayed during school visits to something more alert, more focused. His ears pricked forward, swiveling like satellite dishes trying to lock onto a signal, and his nostrils flared as he processed the complex bouquet of scents that filled the room. Lisa noticed the change immediately, her hand, instinctively, dropping to rest on Ranger's back as she felt the subtle tension radiating through his muscular frame. At exactly 10 o'clock, Uncle Tony arrived with the cake that would change everything. He moved through the school's security checkpoint with the casual confidence of someone who belonged, his sun-faded Yankees cap pulled low over eyes, hidden behind wraparound sunglasses that never came off, despite being indoors. The cake box in his hands looked innocent enough, white cardboard with a clear, plastic window that revealed the colorful frosting and plastic dinosaurs that had delighted so many children over the years. But there was something about the way he carried it, too carefully, too deliberately, like someone transporting something far more valuable and dangerous than a birthday dessert. Mrs. Kelly greeted him with the warm professionalism that 20 years of teaching had perfected, thanking him for taking the time to deliver Aidan's special day surprise personally. Uncle Tony's smile was practiced, rehearsed, the kind of expression that looked genuine from a distance but felt hollow up close, like a photograph of happiness rather than the real thing. He placed the cake on the designated table with movements that were just a fraction too precise, his fingers lingering on the box for just a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back, muttered something about traffic, and disappeared through the classroom door with the same unsettling efficiency with which he had arrived. That was when Ranger began to growl. It started as a low rumble deep in his chest, barely audible above the excited chatter of children anticipating their sweet treat, but it quickly escalated into something more urgent, more insistent. His amber eyes locked onto the cake with laser-like intensity, his entire body going rigid, as if every muscle fiber was preparing for action. Lisa had worked with Ranger for 5 years, had seen him in high-stress situations, had watched him track suspects through dangerous terrain and detect hidden contraband in environments designed to confuse and overwhelm his senses. She had never seen him react to anything the way he was reacting to this birthday cake, and that realization sent adrenaline flooding through her system like ice water in her veins. The transformation in Ranger's behavior was so sudden and dramatic that it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, leaving behind a vacuum filled only with the sound of his increasingly aggressive vocalizations and the bewildered silence of 23 children who had never seen their friendly police dog behave like a predator stalking prey. Lisa Brennan felt her training kick in like muscle memory, her hand moving instinctively to her radio while her eyes swept the classroom for potential threats, escape routes, and anything that might explain why her partner's finely tuned instincts were screaming danger in a room full of innocent third-graders celebrating a birthday. Mrs. Kelly's cheerful demeanor faltered as she watched Ranger's hackles rise, the coarse hair along his spine standing erect like the quills of a threatened porcupine, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that looked less like a domestic animal's and more like weapons designed by nature for tearing and destroying. The children began to shift uncomfortably on the carpet, their excitement curdling into uncertainty as they recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture, that their special day was becoming something else entirely, something that made their stomachs twist with the kind of fear that has no name but feels like ice forming in warm places. Aiden Carter remained frozen at his desk, his small frame rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with typical childhood shyness and everything to do with the terrible knowledge that was eating him alive from the inside like acid through metal. Lisa approached the cake table with the careful deliberation of someone diffusing a bomb, every step calculated and precise, her eyes never leaving Ranger's face as she tried to understand what her four-legged partner was trying to communicate through his escalating distress. The German shepherd's growl deepened, becoming something primal and terrifying, a sound that seemed to emerge from some ancient place where wolves still remembered what it meant to hunt and kill and survive, in a world where death could come disguised as anything, even birthday cake decorated with smiling plastic dinosaurs. When Lisa gave the command for Ranger to sit, the command that had never failed in 5 years of partnership, he remained standing, every muscle in his powerful body coiled like a spring under maximum tension, his intelligent eyes conveying a message that transcended the barriers between species. This is wrong. This is dangerous. This will hurt someone if you don't listen to me right now. Mrs. Kelly's voice cracked slightly as she attempted to restore normalcy to the situation, suggesting that perhaps Ranger was simply excited about the cake or reacting to unfamiliar smells from the cafeteria down the hall. But even as the words left her mouth, she could feel their inadequacy hanging in the air, like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell but no one wanted to acknowledge. Lisa's radio crackled to life as she called for backup, her voice steady and professional, despite the chaos of thoughts racing through her mind as she tried to process what was happening and formulate a response that would keep everyone safe, while allowing her to investigate whatever was triggering Ranger's unprecedented behavior. The classroom began to feel smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls were slowly closing in on them, and the innocent decorations that had seemed so cheerful just minutes earlier now felt like props in a stage play about normalcy that was rapidly deteriorating into something much darker and more dangerous. Aiden's whispered confession, when it finally came, fell into this tension like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually grow into waves powerful enough to destroy everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and the people they had been taught to believe would protect them from harm. "My uncle said not to eat it," he murmured, his voice so quiet that it might have been mistaken for the wind, if not for the fact that every adult in the room had suddenly become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every breath. He said just pretend it was from him. Those words transformed the atmosphere in the classroom from tense to explosive, as if someone had just announced that the building was on fire or that an armed intruder was loose in the hallways, and Lisa felt her blood pressure spike as the implications of what the boy had just revealed began to cascade through her consciousness like dominoes falling in perfect, terrifying sequence. The evacuation of Mrs. Kelly's classroom proceeded with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from years of emergency drills and professional training. But beneath the surface calm, every adult in the building could feel the electric tension of a situation spiraling beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Lisa Brennan's radio chatter filled the hallway with coded language that meant nothing to the children being escorted to safety, but everything to the growing number of law enforcement personnel converging on Lincoln Elementary School like antibodies rushing to fight an infection. Ranger remained fixed in position beside the cake table, his powerful frame radiating an intensity that seemed to bend the very air around him, his amber eyes never wavering from the object that had triggered every alarm in his highly trained mind. The bomb squad arrived within minutes, their heavy vehicle rumbling into the school parking lot like some mechanical beast designed for war rather than the peaceful suburbs of upstate New York, its presence transforming the familiar landscape of swing sets and soccer fields into something that belonged in a disaster movie rather than real life. Martinez, the squad's senior technician, moved through the empty classroom with the careful precision of a surgeon, his hands steady, despite the weight of responsibility that came with being the person everyone was counting on to determine whether they were dealing with a genuine threat or an elaborate false alarm triggered by an overly sensitive police dog. The portable X-ray scanner hummed to life with electronic efficiency, its display screen casting an eerie blue glow across Martinez's weathered face as he positioned the device over the birthday cake that had brought their ordinary Tuesday morning to a screeching halt. What appeared on that screen would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives, a digital revelation that transformed their understanding of evil from something abstract and distant into something immediate, tangible, and terrifyingly real. The cake's internal structure materialized layer by layer like an archaeological dig in reverse, revealing first the expected swirls of frosting and cake batter, then the hollow spaces that might have been normal air pockets, and finally, nestled in the base layer like a sleeping serpent, the unmistakable outline of a metallic object wrapped in plastic sheeting. Martinez's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he adjusted the scanner's resolution, bringing the hidden contents into sharper focus, and when the truth finally emerged in all its stark clarity, the silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the soft, electronic whir of machinery and the distant sound of children's voices echoing from the gymnasium where they had been relocated for their safety. The loaded handgun taped inside the cake's base layer wasn't just a weapon, it was a message, a threat, a chess move in a game where children were pawns and birthday. Celebrations became delivery systems for instruments of violence and intimidation. Lisa stared at the X-ray image, her mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered, trying to process how someone could be so calculating, so coldly manipulative as to use a child's special day as camouflage for what was clearly a sophisticated operation designed to bypass every security measure the school had in place. The plastic wrap that surrounded the weapon suggested careful planning, protection against moisture and detection, while the precision of its placement indicated someone with intimate knowledge of how birthday cakes were constructed, transported, and handled in educational environments. As Martinez carefully began the process of disarming and extracting the hidden weapon, Lisa found herself looking at Aiden Carter with new eyes, seeing not just a shy 9-year-old, but a victim caught in the crosshairs of something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The boy's earlier confession about his uncle's instructions took on new dimensions of horror as she began to understand that this wasn't a random act of violence, but part of a larger pattern of manipulation and control that had been playing out in the shadows of their community for who knows how long. The gun itself, when finally removed from its sugary hiding place, proved to be a small caliber pistol with the serial numbers filed off, the kind of untraceable weapon that professionals used when they wanted to send messages or eliminate problems without leaving evidence that could be traced back to them. The revelation that someone had been willing to use a child's birthday celebration as a delivery system for such a weapon represented a level of depravity that challenged everything Lisa thought she knew about the criminal mind and the lengths to which evil would go to achieve its objectives. As the immediate crisis began to wind down and the school was declared safe, Lisa realized that this was only the beginning of what would prove to be the most challenging and dangerous investigation of her career, one that would test not only her professional skills, but her faith in the very systems she had sworn to protect and serve. The hospital's pediatric wing had been designed to comfort frightened children, with its soft pastel walls and cartoon characters painted along the corridors, but no amount of cheerful decoration could mask the gravity of what was unfolding in the small consultation room where Aiden Carter sat wrapped in a blanket that seemed far too large for his diminutive frame. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child trauma specialist who had been called in to conduct the interview, possessed the rare combination of clinical expertise and maternal warmth that made even the most traumatized children feel safe enough to speak their truth. But as she looked into Aiden's dark eyes, she could see layers of fear and secrecy that had been building for months like sediment at the bottom of a lake. Lisa Brennan sat quietly in the corner with Ranger at her feet, the German Shepherd's presence serving as a living reminder that there were still protectors in a world that had shown this child far too much betrayal and danger. The boy's hands never stopped moving, fingers twisting and untwisting the edge of his blanket in patterns that spoke of anxiety so deeply ingrained it had become muscle memory, while his eyes darted between the adults in the room with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of every person in his vicinity. When Dr. Chen asked about his mother, Aiden's entire body seemed to shrink into itself, as if he were trying to disappear completely, rather than confront the painful reality of Amanda Carter's absence from his life. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone who had learned that saying, "The wrong thing could have devastating consequences for the people he loved most." The story that emerged over the next 2 hours painted a picture of systematic intimidation and psychological manipulation that would have been difficult to believe if not for the physical evidence of the weapon-laden birthday cake that had brought them all together in this sterile room where childhood innocence went to die. Amanda Carter hadn't abandoned her son, as the official record suggested. She had been forced into hiding after agreeing to testify against Anthony Vega, the man who had masqueraded as Uncle Tony while using Aiden as an unwitting courier for weapons and messages that could have destroyed multiple lives. The complexity of the situation began to reveal itself like a Russian nesting doll, each layer of deception hiding another deeper truth about the network of criminals who had infiltrated their community and corrupted the very systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Aiden's confession about the months of threats and manipulation he had endured painted a portrait of evil so sophisticated and calculating that it challenged every assumption the adults in the room had made about the nature of childhood and the boundaries that supposedly protected innocent lives from adult corruption. The boy described how Uncle Tony had gradually inserted himself into their lives, appearing at moments of vulnerability with offers of help and support that came with invisible strings attached, creating a web of obligation and fear that made resistance seem impossible and escape unthinkable. The birthday cake had been just the latest in a series of deliveries that Aiden had been forced to facilitate, each one carrying hidden cargo that he was instructed never to examine or question, under threat of harm coming to his mother, who had already vanished once and could disappear forever if he failed to follow instructions exactly as given. Dr. Chen's careful questioning revealed that the psychological manipulation had been as sophisticated as it was cruel, with Vega using techniques designed to break down the natural trust between parent and child while positioning himself as the only source of safety and stability in a world that had become unpredictable and dangerous. The trauma specialist noted signs of complex PTSD in the boy's responses, the kind of deep psychological scarring that came not from a single violent incident, but from months of sustained psychological warfare waged against someone whose developing mind was still learning to distinguish between truth and lies, safety and danger, protectors and predators. As the interview progressed, Lisa found herself struggling with a rage so pure and focused that it threatened to overwhelm her professional objectivity. The realization that someone had been willing to weaponize a child's love for his mother as a tool of coercion and control, representing a level of moral bankruptcy that challenged her faith in humanity itself. The knowledge that Aiden had been carrying this burden alone for months, terrified into silence by threats against the one person he loved most in the world, transformed him from a case study into a symbol of every child who had ever been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect them from exactly this kind of predatory exploitation. The federal task force assembled to locate Amanda Carter operated out of a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Albany, its windows tinted dark enough to prevent curious passers-by from glimpsing the wall-mounted maps, surveillance photos, and digital displays that transformed the mundane conference room into a war room dedicated to hunting predators who had learned to hide in plain sight. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had spent 15 years tracking human trafficking networks that operated along the northeastern corridor, but the sophistication of Vega's operation impressed even her cynical sensibilities with its ability to corrupt legitimate institutions and turn public servants into unwitting accomplices in their own criminal enterprise. The search for Amanda Carter required a delicate balance between speed and stealth, as any indication that law enforcement was closing in could trigger a response that would put both mother and child in immediate mortal danger from an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened their operations. Lisa Brennan found herself working longer hours than she had since her rookie years, poring over financial records, phone logs, and surveillance footage, while Ranger lay at her feet, the German Shepherd's steady presence serving as a reminder that this case had begun with his instincts and would likely require those same finely tuned senses to reach a successful conclusion. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a rural clinic in Vermont, where a woman matching Amanda's description had sought treatment for a broken wrist, paying in cash and providing a false name, but displaying the kind of nervous hypervigilance that experienced medical professionals had learned to recognize as a sign of someone living in fear. The clinic's nurse, a former military medic named Patricia Gonzalez, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and developed an eye for people whose injuries told stories they weren't willing to share verbally, and something about this particular patient had triggered her instincts enough to make her file a detailed incident report that eventually found its way to the federal database. The photograph that Amanda had reluctantly allowed the clinic to take for their medical records showed a woman who looked decades older than her actual age, her eyes holding the hollow exhaustion of someone who had been running for so long that standing still felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The safe house where they eventually located her was a cabin, so remote that GPS coordinates were the only reliable way to find it, surrounded by dense forest that provided both concealment and multiple escape routes for someone who had learned to think like prey in a world full of predators. When the federal team finally approached the cabin in the gray light of dawn, Amanda Carter was sitting on the front porch with a rifle across her knees, not pointing it at anyone, but making it clear that she had no intention of going anywhere without a fight, her maternal instincts having been honed into something sharp and dangerous by months of living with the knowledge that her child was being used as leverage against her compliance and silence. The reunion between mother and son took place in a secure facility designed to protect witnesses whose testimony could bring down criminal organizations, but no amount of institutional security could contain the emotional explosion that occurred when Aidan saw his mother for the first time in almost a year. Lisa witnessed the moment from across the room, watching as a 9-year-old boy who had been forced to grow up far too quickly finally allowed himself to be a child again, sobbing into his mother's shoulder with the kind of desperate relief that comes only after prolonged separation and the constant fear that such a reunion might never be possible. Amanda's hands shook as she held her son, her own tears mixing with his as she whispered apologies for leaving him alone, promises that they would never be separated again, and reassurances that the nightmare was finally coming to an end, though all 3 adults in the room knew that the legal process ahead would test their family's resilience in ways that might prove even more challenging than the separation itself. The complexity of their situation became apparent as federal prosecutors outlined the steps necessary to ensure their safety while building a case strong enough to neutralize the entire network that had terrorized them, a process that would require Amanda to relive her trauma in courtrooms and depositions, while trusting a system that had already failed them once to provide the protection they desperately needed. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment of both mother and child revealed the kind of psychological damage that would require years of therapy to address, but also noted the remarkable resilience that had allowed them to survive an ordeal that would have broken many families completely, their love for each other serving as an anchor in a storm that had threatened to sweep away everything they held dear. The courthouse in downtown Albany had witnessed decades of legal drama, but few cases had generated the level of security and media attention that surrounded the prosecution of Anthony Vega and his criminal network, with federal marshals positioning themselves at every entrance while reporters waited behind police barriers for glimpses of the witnesses whose testimony would determine whether justice would finally be served after months of terror and manipulation. Amanda Carter's preparation for her testimony had been grueling, requiring her to relive every moment of intimidation and threat, while prosecutors coached her through the kind of aggressive cross-examination that defense attorneys would use to discredit her credibility and paint her as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by revenge rather than truth. The courtroom itself felt like a theater where the fate of multiple families would be decided by 12 strangers who had been carefully selected for their ability to remain impartial, despite the emotional intensity of testimony that would challenge their faith in humanity and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about the predators who walked among them disguised as ordinary citizens. Lisa Brennan sat in the gallery with Ranger at her feet, the German shepherd's presence serving as a reminder that this case had begun with his instincts and would end with human justice, though she couldn't shake the feeling that no verdict could truly compensate for the trauma that had been inflicted on innocent children whose only crime had been trusting adults who should have protected them. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into law enforcement, child services, and judicial systems, with Vega's organization using their knowledge of bureaucratic procedures to identify and exploit vulnerable families while counting on institutional inertia to prevent anyone from connecting the dots until it was too late to prevent irreparable damage. Defense attorneys attempted to portray their client as a small-time criminal who had been scapegoated by federal prosecutors desperate to show progress in their war against human trafficking, but their strategy fell apart when presented with the physical evidence of weapons hidden in birthday cakes and the testimony of children whose voices carried the unmistakable ring of truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. Amanda's voice never wavered as she described the months of psychological torture that had forced her into hiding, her love for her son giving her the strength to face down the man who had threatened to destroy everything she held dear, while Aiden's video testimony played on screens throughout the courtroom, his 9-year-old voice explaining how Uncle Tony had taught him to be afraid of everyone, except the people who were hurting him. The moment when the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict felt like the entire courtroom was holding its breath, months of investigation and preparation condensing into a single instant that would determine whether the sacrifices made by Amanda and Aiden had been worthwhile or whether their courage would be rewarded with the kind of legal failure that would send them back into hiding for the rest of their lives. The word guilty echoed through the marble halls with the finality of a church bell, followed by a sentencing phase that would put Anthony Vega behind bars for the rest of his natural life, ensuring that his particular brand of evil would never again threaten innocent families who had committed no crime other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time when predators came hunting for victims. Lisa felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as she watched Vega being led away in shackles, knowing that justice had been served, but also understanding that the damage he had inflicted on multiple families could never be completely undone, that somewhere other children were still living in fear of adults who had learned to weaponize trust and love as tools of exploitation and control. The media coverage that followed the trial would bring national attention to the vulnerability of children in protective services and the need for better oversight of the systems designed to keep them safe. But for Lisa and Ranger, the real victory was measured in smaller terms: a boy who could finally sleep through the night without nightmares, a mother who could walk down a street without looking over her shoulder, and the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing required nothing more complicated than listening to a dog's growl and taking it seriously enough to act. The courtroom began to empty as reporters rushed to file their stories and lawyers packed their briefcases, but Amanda Carter remained seated in the witness section, her hand resting on her son's shoulder as they watched their tormentor disappear through the door that would separate him from decent society for the remainder of his miserable existence. Their ordeal finally over, but their healing just beginning. 3 months after Anthony Vega's conviction brought what everyone believed was closure to the nightmare that had shattered multiple families, Officer Lisa Brennan found herself responding to what should have been a routine welfare check at Greenwood Trailer Park, the kind of call that usually involved nothing more serious than a neighbor dispute or a child who had missed too many days of school. But as her cruiser pulled into the gravel driveway of Lot 18, Ranger's behavior immediately signaled that this was anything but routine, his ears snapping forward with the same laser-like focus that had saved lives months earlier when he detected danger hidden beneath birthday cake frosting. The trailer itself looked like it had been abandoned. By Hope itself, its aluminum siding streaked with rust and neglect, windows covered with cardboard and duct tape, while garbage bags overflowed from a makeshift pile beside the sagging front porch where a child's tricycle lay on its side like a discarded dream slowly being consumed by weeds. Jennifer Morrison, the Child Protective Services worker who had requested police backup for the welfare check, stood beside her state-issued sedan with the kind of tense posture that came from years of walking into situations where adults had failed children in ways that challenged every assumption about human decency and parental instinct. The anonymous tip that had triggered this investigation came from someone who claimed to have seen a young girl living in the trailer without adult supervision, possibly a runaway or trafficking victim who had been abandoned by whoever had been using her for purposes that decent people preferred not to contemplate. Lisa approached the trailer with Ranger at her side, the German Shepherd's nose working overtime as he processed the complex bouquet of scents that told stories of fear, neglect, and secrets too dangerous for a child to carry alone. his powerful frame radiating the same alert tension that had preceded his discovery of the hidden weapon that could have destroyed innocent lives. The knock on the trailer door echoed through the metal structure like thunder, but the response came not as words, but as a whispered question that seemed to drift through the thin walls like smoke. "Are you the one with the dog?" Lisa felt her heart rate spike as she recognized the pattern, another child whose trust had been so thoroughly shattered that she could only communicate through questions designed to test whether the adults at her door were predators or protectors, whether this moment represented rescue or simply another chapter in a nightmare that seemed to have no ending. When the door finally opened, it revealed a girl who looked like she had aged decades in the span of 8 or 9 years, her tangled hair framing a face that held the kind of premature wisdom that comes only from surviving experiences that should never touch childhood, while her oversized clothing hung on her small frame like camouflage designed to make her invisible to the predators who had already stolen too much of her innocence. Marley Winters moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that sudden movements could trigger violence, that speaking too loudly could bring unwanted attention, and that trusting adults was a luxury that could cost more than a child's developing psyche could afford to pay. But when Ranger approached her with his characteristic gentle confidence, something in her demeanor shifted, as if she recognized in this four-legged protector a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to be vigilant, to read danger in subtle signs, and to stand guard against threats that others might dismiss or ignore. Yeah. Trailer's interior told a story of abandonment and neglect that went far beyond simple poverty, with empty food containers scattered across surfaces that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, while the absence of any adult belongings suggested that Marley had been left to fend for herself by whoever had been using this location as a temporary hiding place. Lisa's radio crackled to life as she called for additional backup and child services support, but her attention remained focused on the girl who seemed to communicate more effectively with Ranger than with any of the human beings who were trying to help her navigate a world that had already betrayed her trust too many times to count. The missing child database search that followed would reveal that Marley Ray Winters had disappeared from a shelter in Louisiana 2 years earlier, her case classified as inactive after months of fruitless investigation that had failed to uncover any trace of her whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance. The realization that she had been living in the shadows for all this time, moved from location to location by people who saw children as commodities rather than human beings deserving protection and love, represented yet another failure of the systems designed to keep vulnerable young people safe from exactly this kind of exploitation and abuse. The pattern recognition software used by federal investigators to track human trafficking networks had been programmed to identify connections that human analysts might miss, correlating data points across multiple jurisdictions and time periods to reveal the subtle threads that connected seemingly unrelated cases of missing children and corrupted officials. When Marley Winters' case file was entered into the system, the computer algorithms immediately flagged similarities to the Anthony Vega investigation that sent chills down the spine of every law enforcement officer who understood the implications of what they were discovering. Special Agent Rebecca Torres stared at her monitor as the software highlighted connections between the Louisiana shelter where Marley had disappeared, the Vermont safe house where Amanda Carter had been hiding, and a network of facilities that stretched across 6 states, all of them linked by financial transfers, personnel movements, and communication patterns that suggested a level of coordination that made Vega's operation look like amateur hour. Lisa Brennan found herself once again working 18-hour days as the investigation expanded to encompass not just individual predators, but entire systems that had been corrupted from within, with social workers, law enforcement officers, and judicial officials all playing roles in an enterprise that treated children like inventory to be managed and distributed according to the demands of clients whose appetites for exploitation seemed to have no limits. The safe house where Marley was temporarily placed became a fortress of security personnel and surveillance equipment, but no amount of technology could provide the kind of comfort that came from Ranger's steady presence beside her bed each night, the German Shepherd serving as a living reminder that some protectors could be trusted completely because their loyalty was hardwired into their DNA rather than corrupted by money or power. Dr. Sarah Chen's assessment of Marley revealed trauma patterns that were disturbingly similar to what she had observed in Aden. Carter, suggesting that the perpetrators were using standardized techniques of psychological manipulation designed to break down children's resistance while making them dependent on their captors for basic survival needs. The investigation team realized they were dealing with an organization that had studied child psychology with the same scientific rigor that legitimate researchers used to develop therapeutic interventions, except their goal was to create compliant victims rather than heal. Damaged psyches. Phone records obtained through federal warrants revealed communication between facilities across multiple states, with coded language that referred to children by numbers rather than names, and discussed their placement and transportation with the cold efficiency of a logistics company, managing inventory rather than human beings whose lives were being destroyed one trafficking incident at a time. The breakthrough that would ultimately expose the full scope of the conspiracy came from an unexpected source: Marley's whispered confession to Ranger during one of their quiet sessions in the secure facility where she was being protected while investigators built their case. She had been talking to the German Shepherd as if he were a furry confessor, sharing secrets that she couldn't bear to tell the human adults who were trying to help her, when she mentioned that her mother was still alive and hiding somewhere in Virginia, waiting for the right moment to reclaim her daughter from the people who had stolen her future. The revelation that Grace Winters had not abandoned her child, but had been systematically excluded from the legal process that terminated her parental rights, added another layer of corruption to an already complex web of institutional failure and criminal conspiracy. Court records that should have documented proper notification and due process were revealed to be fabricated, with forged signatures and falsified timestamps that allowed children to be legally kidnapped from parents who were never given the opportunity to fight for their rights. The safe house raids that followed Marley's information led to the discovery of 12 more children who had been reported as runaways or abandoned when they were actually victims of a trafficking network that used the foster care system as a hunting ground for vulnerable minors who could disappear without anyone in authority asking uncomfortable questions. Lisa watched from the observation deck as federal agents coordinated simultaneous operations across 6 states, their radios crackling with updates that painted a picture of criminal enterprise so vast and sophisticated that it challenged every assumption about the safety of American children and the integrity of the institutions designed to protect them. The arrest warrants that were served that night included not just street-level traffickers, but social workers, family court judges, and law enforcement officers who had used their positions of trust to facilitate crimes against the most vulnerable members of society, their corruption representing a betrayal of public service that would require years of institutional reform to address properly. When the dust settled and the final arrest was made, the investigation had exposed a network that had been operating for over a decade, with hundreds of victims and millions of dollars in profits generated from the systematic exploitation of children whose only crime had been needing help from adults who chose to harm them instead. The Federal Witness Protection Facility, where Grace Winters had been living under an assumed identity, felt more like a prison than a refuge, its concrete walls and bulletproof windows serving as constant reminders that freedom was a luxury that victims of organized crime could rarely afford, even after their tormentors had been identified and arrested. When Lisa Brennan arrived with the news that her daughter had been found alive and safe, Grace's reaction was so intense that the medical staff had to intervene with sedatives to prevent her from collapsing under the weight of emotions that had been suppressed for 2 years of not knowing whether Marley was dead or alive somewhere in the shadow world of human trafficking. The reunion itself took place in a sterile conference room designed for witness interviews rather than family reconciliation, but no amount of institutional coldness could diminish the power of a mother and daughter finding each other again after being deliberately separated by people who understood that destroying family bonds was the most effective way to break the spirit of both victims and those who loved them. Ranger lay quietly in the corner as Marley ran into her mother's arms with the desperate hunger of someone who had been starving for the kind of unconditional love that only exists between parent and child, their tears mixing together as they held each other with the fierce determination of people who had learned that such moments of grace were precious beyond measure and could be stolen away at any moment by forces beyond their control. Grace's whispered words of apology for not being able to protect her daughter were met with Marley's insistence that none of what had happened was her mother's fault, a mature understanding that no 8-year-old should possess, but that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit when tested by circumstances that would break many adults. Completely. Dr. Chen observed the reunion from behind one-way glass, taking notes on the complex dynamics of trauma bonding and recovery, while marveling at the strength that both mother and daughter had shown in surviving an ordeal that had been designed specifically to destroy their relationship and leave them isolated and vulnerable to further exploitation. The legal process of restoring Grace's parental rights would take months of court hearings and bureaucratic procedures, but the DNA tests and witness testimony that had already been collected provided overwhelming evidence that her rights had been terminated through fraud and corruption rather than any legitimate concerns about her fitness as a parent. The safe house where Grace and Marley were relocated for their protection had been selected specifically for its isolation and security features, surrounded by dense forest that provided both concealment and natural barriers against anyone who might want to silence witnesses whose testimony could bring down what remained of the trafficking network that had destroyed so many lives. Lisa made regular visits to check on their welfare and coordinate with federal marshals who were responsible for their security, but she also came because watching them rebuild their relationship provided a kind of healing that her own heart needed after months of confronting the worst aspects of human nature and institutional failure. Marley's attachment to Ranger had become so strong that Dr. Chen recommended allowing regular visits between the girl and the German Shepherd as part of her therapeutic recovery process, recognizing that the dog's presence provided a sense of safety and stability that human adults were still working to earn after years of betrayal and abandonment. The conversations between mother and daughter revealed the extent to which both had been psychologically manipulated, with Grace having been told that her daughter was dead, while Marley was informed that her mother had abandoned her voluntarily, lies designed to prevent them from seeking each other and to make them more dependent on their captors for basic emotional needs. Grace's own story of survival included months of hiding in rural locations while trying to gather evidence that would prove her daughter had been kidnapped rather than placed in protective custody, her maternal instincts driving her to continue searching even when law enforcement officials told her that her case was hopeless and her daughter was probably dead. The revelation that she had been living within 50 miles of one of the facilities where Marley had been held added another layer of cruel irony to their separation, suggesting that the traffickers had deliberately kept them close enough that they might have found each other if not for the sophisticated psychological warfare that kept victims isolated and hopeless. Their reunion represented not just personal healing, but a victory against an organization that had counted on destroying family bonds as part of their business model, proving that love could survive even the most systematic attempts to eradicate it through manipulation and abuse. The revelation that corruption had penetrated the very heart of the law enforcement agencies investigating the trafficking network came like a sledgehammer blow to Officer Lisa Brennan's faith in the institutions she had sworn to serve and protect, transforming colleagues she had trusted into potential enemies whose motives could no longer be taken at face value. The digital forensics team analyzing seized computers and communication devices had uncovered encrypted messages that revealed someone with access to classified case files had been feeding information to the traffickers, allowing them to stay one step ahead of law enforcement efforts and relocate their operations before raids could be executed successfully. Special Agent Rebecca Torres convened an emergency meeting in a secure facility far from the Albany field office, her paranoia justified by the growing evidence that the leak was coming from someone high enough in the command structure to have access to operational details that should have been known only to the core investigative team. Lisa sat in the sterile conference room with Ranger at her feet, the German Shepherd's calm presence providing the only anchor of certainty in a world where the line between protector and predator had become dangerously blurred, while charts and photographs covered the walls like evidence in a conspiracy that reached deeper into their own ranks than anyone had dared to imagine. The investigation that followed required a level of operational security typically reserved for counter-terrorism operations, with team members compartmentalized and information shared on a need-to-know basis that transformed colleagues into potential suspects whose every action was scrutinized for signs of betrayal or deception. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Ranger's behavioral analysis during a routine briefing meeting where his sudden alertness and fixation on one particular attendee provided the first concrete indication that someone in that room represented a threat that couldn't be detected through conventional investigative techniques. Detective Ryan Cole had always seemed like the ideal law enforcement officer, with his clean-cut appearance, by-the-book approach to police work, and earnest dedication to protecting children from predators. But his access to witness protection details and safe house locations made him a person of interest when those facilities were repeatedly compromised by people who shouldn't have known where to find them. The surveillance operation that followed Cole's identification as a potential leak required Lisa to maintain normal working relationships while secretly documenting his activities, a psychological burden that added another layer of stress to an investigation that had already pushed everyone involved to their emotional and professional limits. The evidence against Cole accumulated slowly but inexorably, with phone records showing contact with known associates of the trafficking network and financial records revealing payments that couldn't be explained through his legitimate salary as a mid-level detective in the anti-trafficking task force. Lisa's personal betrayal ran deeper than professional disappointment as she remembered the conversations where Cole had expressed outrage about crimes against children and sworn dedication to bringing perpetrators to justice, words that now seemed like calculated deception designed to deflect suspicion while he systematically undermined their efforts to protect the very victims he claimed to care about. The arrest operation took place at a remote cabin where Cole had fled when he realized that his cover had been blown, his attempt to destroy evidence interrupted by federal agents who had been monitoring his communications and tracking his movements through sophisticated surveillance technology that left him no escape routes or opportunities to warn his criminal associates. Lisa participated in the arrest despite Torres's concerns about her emotional investment in the case, her need to look Cole in the eye and understand how someone who had taken the same oath to protect and serve could betray that sacred trust for money and personal gain, driving her to confront the human face of corruption that had enabled so much suffering. Cole's confession came not from remorse, but from pragmatic calculation, his realization that cooperation might reduce his sentence, leading to revelations about other corrupt officials and the systematic way that the trafficking network had identified and recruited law enforcement personnel who were vulnerable to financial pressure or ideological manipulation. The debriefing sessions that followed revealed the sophisticated nature of the corruption scheme, with traffickers using detailed psychological profiles to identify officers who were struggling with debt, family problems, or career disappointments that made them susceptible to recruitment approaches disguised as legitimate business opportunities or consulting arrangements. The internal affairs investigation that Cole's arrest triggered would eventually lead to the identification of 17 other law enforcement personnel who had been compromised by the trafficking network, their betrayal, representing a cancer that had metastasized throughout multiple agencies and would require years of institutional reform to eliminate completely. The ripple effects of Ranger's initial discovery at Lincoln Elementary School continued to spread far beyond the borders of Millbrook, as other K-9 units across the country began reporting similar incidents where dogs had detected hidden weapons or trafficking victims in situations that human investigators had dismissed as routine or harmless. A German shepherd named Atlas in Phoenix had alerted to a school supply delivery truck that contained not educational materials, but a sophisticated compartment designed to transport children across state lines without detection, while a Belgian Malinois called Storm in Portland had identified a foster home where children were being systematically abused by people who had passed all the required background checks and psychological evaluations. The National K-9 Law Enforcement Association began documenting these cases as part of a larger study on the superior sensory capabilities of working dogs in detecting human trafficking operations, recognizing that traditional investigative techniques were often inadequate when dealing with criminals who had learned to exploit the blind spots and procedural limitations of conventional law enforcement approaches. Dr. Sarah Chen published research papers detailing the unique trauma patterns she had observed in trafficking victims, noting that children who had been rescued through K-9 interventions showed faster recovery rates and higher levels of trust in therapeutic relationships, possibly because their rescue had come through the intervention of animals whose motives couldn't be questioned or corrupted by adult agendas. The foster family that eventually provided permanent placement for Marley Winters had specifically requested to work with trafficking survivors, their own experience with adopting children from difficult backgrounds having taught them the patience and specialized skills necessary to help young people rebuild their capacity for trust and attachment after systematic betrayal by the adults who should have protected them. Amanda and Aidan Carter had relocated to a small town in Oregon where they lived under new identities provided by the Federal Witness Protection Program, their periodic updates to Lisa describing a quiet life where Aidan was finally able to experience normal childhood activities like Little League baseball and school science fairs without the constant fear that had dominated his early years. The legal reforms that followed the exposure of the trafficking network included mandatory K-9 screenings for all child welfare facilities, enhanced background checks for social workers and family court personnel, and new protocols for investigating cases where children disappeared from protective custody under suspicious circumstances that had previously been attributed to runaways or family reunification. The training programs developed for K-9 units now included specialized modules on human trafficking detection, with dogs learning to identify the specific scent signatures associated with fear, prolonged confinement, and the chemical traces left by restraints and sedatives commonly used by traffickers to control their victims during transportation and initial captivity periods. Ranger himself became something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, with departments from across the nation requesting demonstrations of his detection techniques and consultation on cases where traditional investigative methods had failed to identify trafficking operations that were hiding in plain sight within their communities. The psychological support services that had been developed for trafficking survivors were expanded to include therapy animals, with many victims finding that they could communicate more effectively with dogs than with human therapists during the initial stages of their recovery process, possibly because animals represented the only beings in their experience who had never betrayed their trust or used their vulnerability for personal gain. The interstate task force that emerged from the investigation continued to operate years after the original network had been dismantled, recognizing that the problem of child trafficking was too large and too profitable for any single law enforcement action to eliminate completely, requiring ongoing vigilance and coordination between agencies that had historically operated in isolation from each other. Grace Winters eventually became an advocate for other parents whose children had been lost to trafficking networks. Her first-hand experience with the system's failures and her successful reunion with Marley, providing hope for families who were still searching for missing loved ones and fighting bureaucratic indifference that treated their tragedies as statistics rather than human emergencies. The Memorial Garden, planted outside Lincoln Elementary School, included a bronze plaque dedicated to all the children who had been victims of trafficking, with a special section honoring the K-9 units whose interventions had saved lives and exposed crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely in the shadows of communities that believed themselves safe from such predatory behavior. The ongoing research into the neurological basis for dogs' superior ability to detect human distress and deception continued to yield insights that were being applied not just to law enforcement, but to therapeutic interventions and early warning systems designed to identify vulnerable children before they could be targeted by traffickers who had learned to exploit every weakness in the systems designed to protect them. 5 years have passed since Ranger's growl first shattered the innocent facade of a third-grade birthday party, transforming what should have been a celebration into the opening scene of an investigation that would expose corruption, reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement and child protection services. Officer Lisa Brennan still patrols the streets of Millbrook with her four-legged partner, but their relationship has evolved beyond the traditional boundaries of handler and working dog into something approaching a mystical connection between two beings who have stared into the abyss of human evil and emerged with their faith in justice intact, if forever altered by the knowledge of how easily institutions can be corrupted when good people choose to look away from uncomfortable truths. The children whose lives were saved by Ranger's intervention have grown and healed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark months when their futures hung in the balance. With Aidan Carter now a high school student whose quiet strength and mature wisdom make him a natural leader among his peers, while Marley Winters has discovered a talent for art that allows her to express emotions that words could never adequately convey. The trafficking network that once operated with impunity across 6 states has been completely dismantled, its leaders serving life sentences in federal prisons where they will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent children. But the victory feels incomplete when Lisa considers how many other networks might still be operating in communities where people trust too easily and question too rarely the motives of those who claim to be protecting the vulnerable. The systemic reforms that emerged from the investigation have made it more difficult for predators to exploit institutional weaknesses, but Lisa knows that evil adapts and evolves, finding new methods of camouflage and new vulnerabilities to exploit in its eternal quest to turn innocence into commodity and transform protectors into unwitting accomplices in their own moral downfall. Dr. Sarah Chen's research has revolutionized the treatment of trafficking survivors, but her work has also revealed disturbing patterns suggesting that the problem is far more widespread than law enforcement agencies are willing to admit publicly, with thousands of children disappearing each year into networks that have learned to operate below the radar of conventional investigative techniques. The memorial services held each year for trafficking victims serve as reminders that behind every statistic is a human story of betrayal and loss, but they also celebrate the resilience of survivors who have found the strength to rebuild their lives, and the courage to speak truth to power even when doing so requires them to relive their worst nightmares in courtrooms and congressional hearings. The question that haunts Lisa during quiet moments in her patrol car is whether society has truly learned the lessons that Ranger's instincts tried to teach them that autumn morning, when he refused to ignore the warning signals that human beings had dismissed as irrelevant or coincidental. How many other children are living in situations where their silent cries for help go unheard because the adults around them are too busy, too trusting, or too invested in maintaining comfortable illusions to recognize the signs of predatory behavior that might be hiding behind charitable facades and institutional authority? The training programs that now teach law enforcement officers to pay attention to animal behavior during investigations represent a small step toward a more holistic approach to protecting vulnerable populations. But Lisa wonders if these reforms are enough to address the fundamental problem of human beings' capacity to rationalize away evidence that challenges their assumptions about the safety of their communities. Ranger's legacy extends far beyond the specific lives he saved or the criminal network he helped expose. His story has become a symbol of the importance of trusting instincts that operate below the level of conscious thought, of paying attention to warnings that come in forms that rational minds might dismiss as irrelevant or unreliable. The children who were rescued because of his intervention will carry forward the knowledge that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources, that heroes don't always wear uniforms or speak in human languages, and that the capacity for good exists in forms that transcend the boundaries between species and challenge conventional understanding of intelligence and loyalty. As Lisa drives through the streets of Millbrook on this crisp autumn evening, with Ranger alert and watchful in the passenger seat, she reflects on the sobering reality that their work will never be finished, that somewhere in this peaceful-looking town there might be another child living in fear, another predator hiding behind a mask of respectability, another birthday cake or school delivery or welfare check that could trigger the next chapter in humanity's eternal struggle between those who would harm the innocent and those who have sworn to protect them. The question that lingers in the gathering darkness is simple, yet profound. Are we listening carefully enough to hear the warnings that surround us every day, and do we have the courage to act on what our deepest instincts are trying to tell us about the true nature of the world we inhabit? And you, what did you think about this story? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.